First Corinthians, if you'd like to go ahead and turn there. Today we're going to continue on in just going verse by verse through First Corinthians. It's an interesting thing when you go verse by verse. The great part about it is that you don't skip anything, right? No matter what it is, you don't skip it. You're going to talk about it. And to me, that's really important because a lot of times it would be easy just to skip over things. And again, just because maybe they're too controversial or whatever. But again, this is what I'm going to share with you today. I didn't have any idea it would be such a power, not because I'm sharing it, but because Paul is sharing something that is real important for their culture at the time, the Corinthians culture. Now, where I have been, again, God did a work, right? God did a work in a place called Corinth. Corinth was, I'm going to go over some intro kind of stuff I did at the beginning because it's going to really play into today. But Corinth was basically their version at that particular time in history of Sin City, okay? That is what it was. All of the history books around it talk about Corinth, right? Corinth, it had several things. It was a very wealthy place because of where it was located. It was a port city with two ports on two different seas, right? And then obviously it was a wealthy place. It had a lot of business, a lot of successful people. Again, a lot of wealth, a lot of culture, a lot of, as far as I'm talking about, like theater, arts, right? And then also a lot of athletics. In fact, they had the Corinthian Games there. That in reality, it was the largest, second largest to the Olympics, right? And so all the athletes from all the world came there to participate in those games. And so you go on and on and on with this ancient Corinth. But the other thing too, is that pretty much wherever you went, it was pagan. And a lot of the gods of the Greeks and Romans, but mainly the Greeks, obviously, because it was Greece. And again, most every town had a huge a temple, right? And basically they had lots of temples. I have been to ancient Corinth. I have been in the marketplace. It's called the Agora, right? And I have stood there and seen, and then over to the right, after you face the marketplace, over the right are all these temples, right? All the different gods. There were dozens of them. It was pretty amazing. But the patron goddess of Corinth was Aphrodite. Like in Athens, the patron goddess was Athena. In Ephesus, it was Diana, right? But this was Artemis, which was the god of love, right? Sexuality. And so when you came to Corinth, right? And when you worshiped these pagan gods, you would go to all the different places and whatever they represented, Athena was wisdom. So that town had lots of academics, lots of the Greek philosophers, and all of the things that go with it. So then you came here. That's why it was such a decadent place, because sexuality was kind of what was worshipped there. And again, between 1,000 and 2,000, depending. I've already told you this, but it's going to really come into play. And I wanted to tell you again to remind you so that when we get to it in the scripture, you'll understand. But again, since it was a port town from two different seas, a lot of people came in and out of there. And so as much as 1,000 to 2,000, priestesses committed to serving Artemis would come down into the city because it was up about 1,000 feet. There was this little cliff, if you will, and hill. When you were standing down in Corinth, you would look up to it, and there was this huge temple to Artemis. And then obviously the priestesses would come down. They were basically prostitutes, temple prostitutes. And they would come down, and lead worship, right, to Artemis. And then donation was taken, yeah. And so it became this place, right? It just became this place and everything that went with it. So this is what's interesting. This is where God did a work, which is really interesting. He did a work and many of these Corinthians were becoming believers. But remember, they're still living in this place. Many of them grew up in this place. So there's a curve, a learning curve, right? that's going on. And Paul is talking to them. And so the book of 1 Corinthians was addressing their immaturity. In other words, guys, you should be growing. You should be stronger now than you really are. And so that becomes this thought. And he basically calls them, that they're just immature and that they need to grow up. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we talked on a subject. It's called to be his. Now, here's the key to what I'm going to share with you today. Okay? It'll be an interesting day today, all right? There will be times of great quiet because what I'm going to be talking to you about is sometimes it's difficult to hear, but it also has such emotion that goes with it, right? But called to be his. Now, that's the key. I know I've said this for several weeks, but that is the key. The greatest question you can answer to yourself right now is that, are you his? Okay? Well, not do I believe in God. No. Are you his? That is the question. And then this that I'm going to be talking to you about, it is for you. Right? And it addresses those that are his. Okay? And that is what Paul is appealing to. Okay? Paul doesn't bash the culture around him, right? Paul doesn't do all this stuff, but he does talk to those very bluntly who are his. And that is the greatest thing that you can take with you right now in understanding this passage. Because there will be a lot of you that hear this passage that will not agree with this passage. But if you're his, you will agree. Or at least you realize you have to agree, right? All right. That's what he's talking about as far as, and you'll see it. It's as clear as it can be. Now, this message we've entitled Growing Up in His Family. Growing up is the key term. If you're his, he's called you to grow up. We kind of finished up last week that if you're his, he's at work in your life, right? The scripture teaches it. And that he's going to teach and train you to be who he's called you to be. And he's at work. He's at work. And there's a lot of things he's not just going to let you be satisfied with or not let you be happy with. Why? Because he's at work for you to grow, right? Maturity is the key phrase. Maturity is the key phrase. So last week, okay, we talked to you in chapter 4, verse 14. And here's what I want you to tell, especially today. In verse 14 it says, Paul says, I don't write these things to you, the Corinthians. I don't write these things to shame you. He tells them straight out, because he's going to be telling them some things that are going to be tough to hear. It'd be tough for a lot of folks in here to hear, right? But he says, I'm not writing these things. I am not writing these things to shame you, but I am to admonish you as beloved children. So the thought here is Paul sees himself, if you will, a spiritual parent to help them to grow up. Right? So that's the whole thought. Now, he gives them a couple of things, 3 things. We talked about 2 last week. And I'm gonna fly through these. If you want to hear last week, I was amazed at how much what we did last week generated questions at the guest reception, right? Because I didn't go into it very much, and I'm not going to. If you want to listen to last week's, then kind of go online and listen to it, because no way I can cover it again. But I do want to cover what we talked about. Right? Number one is discipline in his family. In other words, there is a standard, right? And there's a standard to being a part of God's family if you're his. And there was one guy who was way out of bounds. You can read about it in chapter 5, verse 1, and with immorality, right? And actually he had his father's wife, right? And we talked about it last week, right? And Paul said, listen, even pagans don't tolerate that. And you need to remove him, right? You need to remove him from the fellowship of the church, which in our culture would sound very judgmental, but obviously, Paul said this is what's the way it's supposed to be. And eventually it's kind of like the prodigal son. How come the prodigal son didn't stay, okay, and live the way he wanted to at dad's house? Because dad wouldn't allow it. So the prodigal son had to leave to a far country, if you know the story of the prodigal son. And then once he'd learned what he needed to learn, he came back a different person. That's what he's telling you. Put him outside, and that's what we talked about last week. So there's a standard of being a part of God's family. God's at work in our lives and teaching us and training us, and that some things, it's just not acceptable. You're not going to do that, not do it here, right? Number 2 is settling problems in his family. This one has to do with lawsuits against one another. Scriptures teach us that among fellow believers, if you are his, is that you and I should not be suing one another and taking it to a court to make a judgment call. But we should be going to fellow believers and let them make the judgment. Pretty radical stuff, all right? We talked about it last week. I'm not going to do it again this week, right? All right? But it's a pretty interesting thing, and yet that's a common occurrence in our culture, and it was very common in the time of the Greeks. I mean, just people suing one another over all kinds of things. Are there legitimate, obviously, things? Of course there are. But a lot of what happens today is not, especially among believers. That's what he talked about in chapter 6, verse 1 and following. And then number 3, which is what we're going to talk about today. All right? And what we're talking about today is that he is addressing the sexual nature that is in all of us. Okay? And the reason he's addressing it is because Corinth was a highly sexualized place. So this is going to be straightforward today. Because you know, kind of the heartbeat I have is just to let it speak. Well, this is about as blunt as it gets. All right? In all of the scriptures, this passage is about as blunt as it gets. And I have to be honest, I don't really relish, talking on this subject. So many folks just talk about it all the time. I just do not, because in our culture, it has become such a topic that it's talked about all the time. In fact, if you listen to any comic or watch any comedy show, 60-70% of the jokes are going to be sexual jokes. And I don't know, and then every time you share something, there's these thoughts and laugh, and people saying, make a joke out of something I said that there's a connotation for something else. I don't. But the great part about going verse by verse is you don't skip anything. So I'm not going to skip it, but I'm going to share with you straightforward what it says. But here's the key. Are you his? That's the key. That's the question you need to answer. If you're not his, then it's a standard, all right, for those that are part of his family. All right? That doesn't mean it's okay for you, but I've just come to understand why Paul is saying what he's saying. Okay? Because if you're not his, then that's the first thing you want to address first, because none of it makes any sense if you're not. Anyway, makes sense. I've entitled number 3, freedom in his family. Freedom is an amazing word. In fact, it says in Galatians chapter 6, I believe it says it was for freedom that Christ has set us free. So you and I have been set free. Right? Now, a lot of times, this is what he's telling the Corinthians. A lot of times we haven't learned to live free. Just because you are something doesn't mean you live that way. So therefore, being free doesn't necessarily mean you've learned to live free. And then immaturity will cause us a lot of times to stay, in bondage to something, right? But this is what he's talking about here, right? Freedom. And it has to do in this particular area, but it goes into all kinds of areas. All right, now, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. Paul says this, all things are lawful for me. All things are lawful for me. So what's he talking about there? Well, let's just set it for what he's saying. Again, I just want this to speak. Let it share with you. What he's saying here is that I'm in Christ. I'm his. And the great part about it is, when you think about who Christ is, what he came to do, it can all be summed up in one word, and the word is grace. That's why I love talking about the word, because it explains everything about who Christ is and what he came to do. Grace is a gift you don't deserve. So if you understand who Christ is and what he came to do, and you have put your faith and trust in him, and you are his, then I have got news for you, right? Is that not only are you forgiven, right, of everything in your past, but also you are completely forgiven of everything that ever will happen. And some people say, Jeff, don't tell everybody that. Yeah, but if you're his, it's different. You know, sometimes people who aren't his hear that and say, well, I'll just do what I want to do then. Yeah, well, it's because you're not his. But if you're his, you're part of his family, and he's at work in your life, and you know that's not acceptable. And you're not going to live that way, at least not to live that way very long, as we've looked into 1 Corinthians. That is what this is about. So he's saying all things are lawful for me. Therefore, okay, I can do whatever I want, is basically what he's saying is. But he says all things are not helpful. Okay, that word helpful, the old King James is probably got the better translation. Expedient. Now, what's the word expedient? Well, if you go on an expedition, you're going on a journey with a purpose. Okay? Therefore, something that is, expedient means it's worthwhile to take along with you. Therefore, there's no use piling on this heavy load if part of what you're taking just drags you down. Okay? So all things are lawful, that is permissible, but all things are not expedient or helpful, right? And he goes on to say this, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything. Okay, now there's your key. You are free, but the greater question is, have you learned to live in that freedom? And that becomes what he's talking about, right? Certain appetites that are God-given, right? We have certain appetites. Thirst, obviously, for water, and an appetite for food. Sexual appetite is an appetite. There are several appetites to succeed or to learn or to grow. And again, it seems like the appetites that we feed are the ones that get stronger, and it's an amazing thing. So what he's talking about here is that all things, all right, are lawful. He says, but I will not be enslaved by anything. Okay, now that's huge. Very few people ever live in the freedom, especially if you're his. Very few people ever live in the freedom that God has for you. All right? Because so many things in the culture that are temptations, it's incredible. It's an incredible thing. It'll all make sense to you here in a minute because Paul is so blunt. And I'll make sure you understand everything he's saying here. All right? So not be enslaved by anything. What is it to be enslaved? To be enslaved is, therefore, it dictates to you. You don't dictate to it. Right? It owns you. You don't own it. All right? That's basically what it meant. Now, he goes in and gives you an illustration. He says food, and this is real important. All right? Food is meant for the stomach, and stomach for the food, for food. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically what it means is that we part of our body, we have a stomach, right? And that stomach can digest food, right? And it's the body is an incredible wonder, is taking organic material and breaking it down into usable energy and repair and growth, and it's just an incredible thing. But the stomach, what it does, it digests the food. So what you need to the stomach is meant for food. So therefore, you can't say, well, I think I'll have dirt today. All right? Because the stomach is not meant for dirt. Now, can you eat dirt? Well, yeah. I don't recommend it. Right? But therefore, when you use something not for what it's meant, you're going to have problems. And therefore, do you have the freedom to do whatever? Well, sure. But is it what's best? Probably not. In fact, the stomach has a way of getting rid of things it doesn't want. Right? So I know it's a little gross, but it is what it is. It's the illustration he's using, and I want you to understand it. All right? There we go. So it goes on saying God will destroy, one and the other. Okay? What does that mean, destroy? Well, God has an eternal purpose, and that is not part of it. Which, again, that's another message for another time. Let's stick exactly with what he's saying here. Now, so he uses this illustration as food's meant for stomach. Therefore, God created this situation. Right? Food and the stomach. All right. Now, let's take a look at verse 13. He says, in the body, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, right? And the Lord for the body. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that God created sexuality. Right? The porn industry didn't. God created it. And it had a purpose, right? Just like when he created the stomach. Stomach has a purpose. And the purpose is for food, and then the supplying of energy and everything else. It's an amazing system. So if you're his today, here's something you need to understand, is that who you are and how you were created sexually, right? It was not meant for sexual immorality. Now, we've already had that defined earlier. What is sexual immorality? It has to do with adultery, right? It also has to do with what some would call fornication, that is sex between those who are unmarried themselves. Adultery is sex between those who are married but are not married to each other. And then it goes on into other things, but basically sexual immorality. Therefore, the sexual nature that is in you, that is God-given, it was not meant for that. Okay? Now, if you really want to know the truth, it's gonna come at you pretty fast here. So then God created this purposefully, and it wasn't meant. What does it mean it wasn't meant? Well, I'm going to give you illustrations are going to be today, right? Because I found that illustrations are like, oh yeah, that is, I get that. All right, let me just give you a few illustrations, and some of them I've shared with you before in past, right? But I'm going to share a couple of them again and do some other ones and different ones. But you'll see what I mean in just a minute. Now, when I was growing up, right? When I was growing up, my grandfather was a typical grandfather. I loved him. He was awesome. Small town guy, and he thought I could do no wrong, all right? And God bless him. And so I loved spending time with him. I just loved it. And when he came back from World War II in 1947, he opened a little service station in the small little town in Tennessee, right? Now, if you don't know what a service station is, right, it's basically a gas. But you have to remember, right, most of you don't even remember this, but used to, you know, when you pulled up to get gas, they would come out and do it for you, right? And now I don't know that there are any that come out and do it for you, right? So there's probably a whole generation of you. You mean people come out and pump it for you? Yeah, absolutely. And so, but that's the way it used to always be, right? And so what happened was all the, attendant would come out and the person would stick their head out of the window and say, fill her up. Okay, there are a few of you that know. And they would start doing everything, okay? They would check all of the air pressure in the tires, right? They would clean your windshield. They would check your oil, fill up your little washer, right? They would do all that, right, while the gas was running, right? Well, anyway, so somebody pulled up, and we had a new employee at the station. And I was still just a kid, real young. And so I wasn't allowed to do a whole lot, but some. But anyway, we had this new guy, and he was so gung-ho, but he was real nervous about his, being first day and whatever. Well, he came out, and he wanted to do everything perfect. He was trying real hard, and this lady came up in her car and said, fill her up, and so he gets it started, and he's going around, and windshield and checking tires and all the rest, and then he gets paid, and takes it in, and then she drives off. But in his nervousness, he didn't realize that he'd filled her up with diesel. Okay, y'all know what I'm talking about then. And so, he just made a mistake, right? He just was nervous and whatever. But a few miles down the road, this lady started having real problems, all right? Because if you don't know what happens, all right, if you're not mechanically inclined, let me tell you what happens. The car gets dissatisfied real fast, and it starts making all kinds of crazy, and smoke, like a bomb when I was like, whoa. And so it was interesting because, we had to make it right and everything like that. But here's the issue, right, is that you have manufacturers and engineers that made this car. And they made it for gas, but they did not make it for diesel. And when you say, well, I'm going to do what I want to do, I'll put diesel in it, well, knock yourself out. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be helpful. This is what he's saying. I just want you to see it. All right? This is what he's saying. Let me share with you a couple other things. All right? I've told this with many of you. In fact, I share a little bit of this at the dinner with the pastor. You know, I do a dinner with the pastor. I think next one's March 5th. And I just kind of share kind of who I am, a little bit about me. But I played football, and I played in college, and that was the place where I got hurt quite a bit. Well, the first injury I had, in fact, I'm not going to go into all that, but there's something you need to hear, and I think it will have impact. But I broke this ankle, and it was real bad, and I still have, in the left ankle, I still have a steel plate and 8 screws, right? In fact, I had 9, and they had to take 1 out because it was broke up pretty bad, and so they had to do some other things. But anyway, so I still have that. Now, when I went into surgery, it was a long surgery as they're putting it all back together kind of thing. And when I came out of it, out of the surgery, that is the most pain I have ever been in my entire life when I woke up. And it was, ankle, it wasn't throbbing, it was screaming. If you've ever been there, you know what I'm talking. Throb is where it beats, but screaming is this constant, right? And it was almost overwhelming, the pain. And then they gave me a shot of Demerol, right? Now, Demerol is God's gift to mankind. All right? It's a painkiller, all right? And I don't even know if they use it much any today. I think they have stronger ones. But at that time, it was God's gift to mankind. And so it was unbelievable, the impact it had on the pain, right? And literally, I took it for, a handful of days until the pain subsided. But here's the issue, is that Demerol, or whatever the drug, is extremely effective when you use it for what it was intended to be used. But it can be damaging if you use it for other uses. Does that make sense? And not only is it damaging, it can be addictive, which I hear now we have more people addicted to prescription drugs than illegal ones. Again, I don't know. Why is that? Because when we start taking it for other uses, like feeling good, right, or some other recreational use, it creates a problem. Why? Because that's not what it's made for. What it's made for is to deal with pain. And brother, I'm here to testify, it's awesome, right? When it's used for what it was made to be used for. I just want you to hear me. Does that make sense? When you understand the reason something was made, then you won't abuse it. But if you abuse it, then there's going to be problems. It's just the way it is. Okay? One more illustration. A lot of you know what this is. All right, this is a laptop, right? Basically. All right, now, this is pretty effective and pretty useful if you know how to use it. You know, Jeff knows how to play hearts, and look up ESPN or something like that. All right, so, but let's say I don't know what it is. And somebody hands this to you and they says, oh, it's pretty cool and it's pretty valuable, but you don't know what it is. All right? Well, you can look at it and say, well, maybe it's a cutting board. All right? Now, can you use this as a cutting board? Yes. But that's not the reason it was made. Right? And more than likely, you'll damage it using it as a cutting board. Does that make sense to you? So that becomes the problem, or maybe I could use it as a hammer, or killing bugs. Lots of uses. This thing has lots of uses. Yeah, but that's not why it was made. And if you don't understand why it was made, then you'll probably mess it up. This is what you and I need to hear. This is what Paul's talking about when you truly understand this nature, is that it was God created and it had a particular purpose. And Paul is trying to tell them, hey, listen, guys, this is not the reason the sexual nature was created, and you're going to wind up causing problems for yourself. And here are some of them. I tell you what, it is probably the most lied about area of our entire lives. Very few people understand, right? Past their own appetite and own gratification of that appetite. But it causes lots of problems that a lot of times people don't even see. And they don't make the connection, right? It goes on to say in verse 14, and God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. But do you not know that your bodies, if you're his, are members of Christ? Okay? And he goes on to say, so I then take the members of Christ and do I make them a member of a prostitute? Well, now you know what he's talking about. That's why I brought it back up and told you. The temple prostitutes there in Corinth. So now you know what he's talking about. He says, guys, he said, if you're his, don't you understand that you're his, right? Don't you know your bodies, you're members of Christ, right? So you're going to take that which is joined to Christ and join it with a prostitute? And he goes on to say, that shouldn't be, right? That's maybe who you were, but that's not who you are now. Interesting. Do you not know that those who are joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? Why? Because the scriptures teach us that the two will become one flesh. What's it talking about? Well, here's the picture. All right, here's a great picture. And maybe sobering and maybe pretty tough to hear, but I want you to hear it. All right? What does the two become one flesh? Well, you hear that at weddings sometimes. Right? You hear that at weddings sometimes, and because it comes from Genesis. Long before the 10 Commandments ever came out, there was the one commandment, right? Is that that a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, right? Two becoming one. And what something is talking about is sexuality, right? That God created this nature, right? And someone to be joined, if you will, to another. And it has huge impact. Having sexual relations with someone is huge. I mean, it has more impact on you than you have any. And we have people around us that try to tell us, oh, it's just a natural function. That's just a lie. God is wrapped up within this, and it carries a whole lot of who you are. Dignity, self-respect, all kinds of emotions and stuff are all wrapped up in this. And it was meant so that two could be joined in marital. That's why it was meant. That's why God created it, and that's why, obviously, children being produced from it, that's why that is attached there too. It makes sense. You understand it. But our world laughs at that, right? Because you and I live in a culture where sexuality casual, as if it's no big deal. But it's having far more effect on you than you ever could realize or understand. Because God's tied a whole lot to this, right? The two becoming one. What does that even mean? What does that even look like? Well, it's like I said, some people say, oh, come on, pastor. And again, it has a lot to do with because you're not his. All right, if you're his, then you're going to get this, because he's going to let you know this is not who you are. At least that's not who you are anymore. But we have a lot of people in our world that are defending that which is not defendable. Because here, let me tell you how impacting this is. And I know this may pull on some heartstrings, and it may really cause some struggle in some of your hearts. That's not my purpose, but truth is my purpose. And I want you to hear it. All right. What is the difference between assault and sexual assault? Well, what is the difference? Well, now hear me out. All right. Assault, maybe you get in a fight, or somebody throws a punch and breaks your nose, or bloodies your nose, or causes a black eye, or whatever, right? Is there any difference between that and a sexual assault, rape, whatever you want to call it? And by the way, let me tell you where I stand on the issue. Other than murder, sexual assault is the worst form of crime. And as far as I'm concerned, it ought to be the maximum penalty in our culture. So just so you know why, but because I understand the sexual nature. I get why it's there, and when that's violated with violence or some other manipulation, whatever, it leaves impact. A broken nose heals, and you can almost get to the point where you forget about it. But this one takes some time. Why? Because God is wrapped up within this relationship a whole lot more than just a physical function. Are you hearing me? It's more than that. It changes things. Always has, always will. Inside of a relationship, a marital relationship that's committed to one another, it can do as much construction within that because of what it was meant to be and to do. It just is what it is. It's psychological. It's an interesting thing that God has done with this. But when we take it on other ones and we start joining with casually, it's even sometimes, well, we are in a committed relationship. Not really. Because if you were in a committed relationship, you'd get married. Right? So there's a reason you're not getting married. I mean, again, I'm just wanting you to hear the truth. Right? I promise it'll be over in a minute, then you can storm out and leave and never come back. But seriously, I just want you to hear it. Because what happens is, what happens is you have lots of committed relationships, right? And they last for a while, and then when they break up, there's pain. Why? Because it's like a divorce. You're living like you're married, but there's always insecurities that come, and the sexual relationship was never to breed insecurity. It was to be part of a committed relationship that you were secure in, and then it can be an amazing glue. But used outside of that, it's just destructive. Right? In fact, so much so, and I'm just going to share with you just a few thoughts just for you to think on, and because I want you to know the truth, right? Because there's nothing quite like it in this world. It so drives people to do dumb things. And somebody said, well, I made a mistake. I said, no, you didn't. Right? A mistake is when you misadd your balance on your bank statement. Think about the number of possibilities it would take for that to be a mistake, right? It's not a mistake. It's a drive. And it will dictate to you. But what happens is, I'm going to kind of share from the male side, is that when we abuse this area, it has huge impacts on us personally. The female also, just as much so, just sometimes it's different. But pornography or lots of immorality, what it does is is that it makes it just a quest of a physical act. And you begin to lose sensitivity and feelings that this other person is a person. Right? And while you're that way, you've abused that area so much, while you're that way, you have no hope of a relationship. At least not one that lasts. Until, well, Jeff, is there any hope to come back? Absolutely, that's what God specializes in. All right, we'll talk about that at the end. Is there any way I can overcome some of the bad mistakes? Absolutely. That's the great thing about grace and God's law. Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what I'm trying to say, I'm trying to get you to see reality and connect the dots to understand what this means. Right? And so then there becomes this great issue to where you wind up not really be able to have a relationship with the opposite sex, right? Without you constantly thinking sexual. Makes you a pretty lonely person in reality is what it does, right? Other than those that are kind of like that too, right? Right? It's an incredible thing. But see, God's called you, and if you're his, he's called you and I to be different, right? He's called you and I to be different. And there's a difference that needs to happen in those that are his. This is what Paul's trying to tell them. Remember who Corinth is and the struggles they had. And so he is asking them to grow up to where your appetites don't rule you. This is what he's telling them. Is that your appetite, why? Because you've been set free. You've been set free from being ruled by that, right? It's an incredible thing when you begin to think about it and when you begin to understand this is what he's talking about. And then as a believer, if you are a believer here today, if you're not, then that's what you have to talk about first, right? Do you want to be his? Do you understand who you are? Do you understand who Christ is, what he came to do? And then understanding, finding the strength to be who he's called us to be comes from him. And that only comes after you're his, right? But listen to what he says in verse 17. This is a powerful statement. Listen to this. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. So he's comparing the consummation of a marriage with someone becoming a believer. That's a powerful statement if you think about it. And you only see it if you read it closely. But so many times when somebody mentions the S word, people's minds go way off, and then all of a sudden you can't get their attention back in. This is what he's talking to them at. He's saying, guys, let me tell you what, this is not what you're looking for. I promise it's not what you're looking for. Because you all know the appetites of this world, especially the sexual one, is that it eventually has diminishing returns to where what was really cool after you've done it a whole lot, you throw it away and you move on to something else. But see, in a marriage, it's different. If it's a committed and it's secure, it can actually build and grow. And it actually makes sort of a, if you will, an addiction to each other, but a good one, right? Two becoming one, right? Two becoming one. It's the same concept of those who are his. It's a powerful thought. Therefore, in verse 17, remember, no church owns this message. This is not a Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, whatever. This is him. You don't become a Catholic or a Methodist. You become his. It's amazing when you begin to see it. It goes on to say in verse 18, flee, run. Okay? Only time in the Bible does it say, most of the time the scriptures teach believers to stand firm. Don't retreat. Except for this area. Run. All right? Why? Because it is that tempting. Right? Don't put yourself in situations like that. You will mess up. Right? And he goes on to say that every other sin a person commits, this is a powerful statement. And I have studied on it and looked at it. And I can give you a little bit of what it is, but I think there's a lot more to it even than what I'm going to share with you. But it says that every other sin a person commits is outside the body. But this one, the sexual immoral, sins against himself or herself. That's an interesting thought. So in reality, you're only hurting yourself. That's what it's saying. It's kind of like me getting all dressed up, right? Putting a mask on, ski mask on, and getting a gun, and going in and robbing a bank, and only taking the money that belongs to me. Right? It's kind of like robbing yourself is the picture of what Paul is saying here. Interesting. Right? Interesting. Right? Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, right? The temple. You know, I've always wanted people to understand. You know, people look at this building. There's nothing sacred about this building. Zero. Nothing. If it burns down tomorrow, we'll go meet somewhere else until it rebuilds, right? Nothing sacred about this building, just a place where we meet. One time I remember, early years, is that this guy came walking into the sanctuary, you know, and somebody just accosted him because he had a ball cap on. And this guy, he always got himself in trouble because his mouth engaged before he thought, right? But this lady accosted him. I can't believe that you're wearing a hat, you know, in church. And he says, the hat's not in church, the hat is on the church. Why? Because this is not the church you are, right? And he got in trouble for that. He was right, but he got in trouble for that. And so you can be right and still get in trouble, right? And so in reality, you know, that's who you are. Right? If you're his, some of the greatest responsibilities I have is to continue to remind you guys who you are if you're his. Because a lot of times, especially in the sexual nature, we can beat ourselves up so bad that we can think a lot less of ourselves than we should. And the value that you have in Christ. Why? Because you're his. So there's lots of wonderful stuff to talk about that we don't have time today. I just want you to understand the truth, okay, about this particular area, because it is such a big deal in our culture, obviously, right? I have to be honest with you, it's not a great thrill for me to talk a whole lot about it, just because it's such a tough issue. And I know a lot of people struggle in this issue. So there's no condemnation, there's no trying to make you feel bad. Guys, that's not my goal. I just want you to see it. And if you're his, all right, he's called you to something different. That is the desire that I have. He goes on to say, now, do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit? Okay, who's in you, whom you have from God? Here it goes on to say, listen to this. You are not your own. Okay? Well, I can do whatever I want to do. No, you can't if you're his. Now, if you're not his, then I get it. But if you're his, you are not your own. You've been bought with a price. What do you mean bought with a price? That is what Christ came to do. Who he is, what he came to do. You've been bought with a price. Therefore, you are his. So, glorify God with that which is his. So you're going to have a responsibility to glorify him, right? As opposed to ourselves. So powerful thing. All right, I've got to be done. But I want to finish with this because I told you I was going to. And because the goal today was not so much how do you get past these things, but I felt like today was a real important day because especially the culture in which you live, I want you to understand, most of the time you don't get to hear the truth. You only get to hear the version of the comics, right? So I just wanted you to hear, I wanted you to hear the truth. The other thing is, Jeff, I'm his, and I've got some real issues, which is probably a good bunch of you in here, because it's prevailing. I mean, it's a prevailing issue. right? 70% now of websites are pornographic, right? And the fastest growing, believe it or not, the fastest growing viewers of pornographic material is women, which is unbelievable to me, right? You know, we just live in a strange world, right? And so Jeff, how do I come back from those things? Now, this is going to take a lot more than just the time I have here, but I want to give you a few things, right? Big thing is relationship. You have a relationship with the Lord, and one that grows, right? One that seeks Him, right? That's the first thing. Number two, you know, I'm reminded of that time when I first got here into Florida. It's been lots of years ago. And they were talking about cleaning up the Everglades. So they spent millions of dollars studying how to clean up those Everglades. And this is what they came up with. Stop polluting it. Okay, that's brilliant, right? I would only charge them $1 million to tell them that, right? Stop polluting it. And then the Everglades will naturally clean itself. Right? The biggest thing you can do is just stop the inflow into your mind. Does that make sense? That's a huge part of it. I don't have time to go into it because I am out of time. Right? I don't have time to go into it. Maybe at another time we will. But that's a huge part of it. You have something about you that if you can stop it and then seek the Lord, you'd be amazed how it'll cleanse through, and all of a sudden it won't be all consuming or enslaving in your mind like it has been. All right? But here's the key. Here's the key. Whew, I'm glad this is over. All right. But here's the key. If you're His, that is the key. Right? And so the thought of 1 Corinthians is teaching those who are His to grow, to whereas the things of this world don't enslave us, especially the appetites. And when we find strength in those areas of our lives that we never had strength in before, it's a thrill in the life of a believer to see those things happen. I want you to see it, right? Because it really is amazing. All right, God bless you.